Perfect. So this is just our opening slide to the India Basin Waterfront Park project. And we are located in San Francisco, California. And I think it's really nice to talk about how we juxtapose projects like those that are happening in New York City with what's happening in San Francisco. So next slide, please. Our project overview here, we've got our mayor, our director of the San Francisco Recreation and Parks Department, Mr. Phil Ginsberg, and community really coming together to celebrate this project. And just the mayor's quote here, this is an important investment in the Bayview Hunters Point community and a big step in creating equity, when it comes to healthy neighborhoods in our city. And I will just, next slide, please. I'll give an example of where we are in San Francisco. So on the right-hand side, you see the entire footprint of San Francisco. And as we focus in on that little star there, that's the Bayview Hunters Point community. And our project is right on the waterfront shoreline. And similar to what we heard before, this was historically a highly industrialized area. There was a lot of boat building and decommissioning activities that happened on this shoreline. And interestingly, that park that's just a little above us on the screen there at Heron's Head Park originally was there to establish a freeway to sort of circumvent the southern side of San Francisco and get you to the south side of the city and Daly City. And over years, they abandoned those plans and realized that that wasn't intended in the best way for our community. Next slide. So as we looked at investing $150 million on this shoreline and really thought about the fact that we were in a community that had been historically disenfranchised, we wanted to set some priorities for the park development that allowed us to build beyond the park. So we knew we were going to be creating this amenity-rich park, but we also knew about the decades of environmental contamination that some of the activities on that shoreline presented. And as we talk about building healthy communities, we knew that we had to include community in that conversation. And so just an overall planning for the park, of course, we wanted to make sure we were incorporating community space along with amenities, and also think about how this impacts the environment and what we could potentially do to plan for climate impacts in the future. Next slide, please. Here are just a few highlights of that park. We have the Shipwright's Cottage, which is actually a historically preserved building that's going to be retained on site and actually host a ton of our historic and cultural elements and act as a welcome center. But our community actually fought really hard to preserve this building and the history that it has. In addition to that, we're going to be adding a food pavilion as well as a maker space and a kayak launch, really increasing water access and building out amenities that are in a side of our city that currently don't exist. And so these are just two different phases of the project, but I'll just go into a little bit more detail. Next slide. So this is what, prior to our remediation efforts, the site actually looked like. And as you can sort of see in the distance, we're adjacent to the community that lives there. And so this portion of the project at 900 Innis Boatyard Park had been clearly neglected, dilapidated, and this was where a majority of those boat building activities took place. So there was significant contamination in the water, in the soil, and that's really where our remediation started and where the grant funding from EPA really helped accelerate cleaning this portion up and moving the project along. Next slide, please. And this is a rendition of what the future park will look like. So if you are standing from the hillside where the residents are, this would be your view every day. And of course, with bringing in a beautiful view, there were a ton of concerns about how this project would actually impact community. And we went on a several-year journey with community to bring community together to discuss this, to have them actively participate in visualizing our future park. Next slide, please. This is just a quick glimpse of the groundbreaking that we had government officials from the local government as well as our state government participating. We've got our mayor, we've got community, and the folks that actually contributed through philanthropic dollars in order to get this project going. And we're well underway. So this was a celebration with community that day. Next slide. And as you see here, this is just sort of how we have broken the project down. The first and most important phase of the project is the remediation, and that should conclude a little later this year. And as we move toward renovating the entire shoreline, we wanted to ensure that we're not closing off any open space or any park access while this construction is happening. So the goal is to complete remediation end of this year, build 900 Innis Park. And once that portion is completed, we will close the India Basin Shoreline Park, which is that blue section, and renovate that, but make sure that the 900 Innis space is available for community. Next slide, please. So as we have done that, as I mentioned, we embarked on a several-year journey with community to develop what we call an equitable development plan. We wanted to build a park beyond just building a park. And as we heard from our keynote speaker, there's so many ways that you want community to connect, not just tell you their vision, but be a part of creating that vision for the future. And that was really how we developed our equitable development plan, or what we call EDP. Next slide. And here's just a slide that really highlights why the process is so important. We knew we were working in, as I mentioned, a historically underserved neighborhood. We're predominantly African-American. And, you know, as we have looked at the housing crisis over the last 10 years, we've also seen a significant decline of the African-American population in San Francisco. And so as we looked at building this wonderful park, investing $150 million in the shoreline, we also wanted to make sure we weren't just making a beautification project, that we weren't pushing neighbors out that lived there historically. And it's a balance, having that conversation with community and addressing the fears and concerns. Next slide. So we established a leadership committee that was a group of community members that wear multiple hats in the community. They ranged in age and socioeconomic background, to have monthly conversations about the future vision of the park and building equity in community being articulated by community. So this is just a glimpse of some of those folks that are awesome, that have worked on the project, that continue to work on the project. And prior to COVID, we were able to gather together. And even during COVID, we adjusted and did what we're doing now, which are our virtual meetings. Next slide, please. So community has always been the priority. And as you can see here, there's just a ton of different meetings that we had to make coming to this project accessible, creating the vision for the project, and figuring out ways on how do we get community to actually participate. So as you can see, we had a ton of different type of meetings with all different folks in the neighborhood to be able to gather feedback and really assess what did the community want. Next slide. And of course, building on this shoreline is a collaboration of multiple agencies, from our planning department to our transportation department. We aren't just building a park and plopping it there and making it beautiful. We also have to talk about, how is this park accessible? What jobs come around with this? And how do we anchor in cultural markers that really help celebrate our existing community. Next slide. So these were just some overall goals for the Equitable Development Plan. Of course, we wanted to support the existing community. We wanted to interrupt displacement of the Black community primarily that has historically lived in the neighborhood. And not only talk about interrupting displacement, but really acknowledge the experience that many of our community members have lived. This goal of the EDP was to look at and accumulate sustained resources that can support the community, that can build capacity, so that we're not in this process forever. We want the community to have ownership of the space and really celebrate this space as their own. Next slide, please. So our community came up with 6 areas of focus, and we really mirrored what we have been doing on the 11th Street Bridge project in Washington, DC. But from what we talked about, we really dialed down into 6 areas of focus, from arts, culture, and identity. That was really the first anchor that we thought was important. And moving into neighborhood connectivity, transit and access. We also talked about workforce development opportunities, not just for adults, but also for youth, pathways for youth. Of course, here we are cleaning up this shoreline, but we're addressing some of the health issues and some of the environmental impacts that have historically plagued our shoreline. And as we've had this conversation, and I mentioned just a little earlier that it was important to acknowledge the housing crisis and make sure that we can figure out ways to provide some housing security through this process. So we are also talking about that. And of course, Recreation and Parks Department, many of these aspects are beyond their jurisdiction, which was why the interdepartmental collaborations have been so important. Next slide. So I won't go into too much detail just in interest of time, but as you can see, for each of our areas of focus, starting with arts and culture, we developed multiple strategies to really talk about how we are building equity throughout the park. And for the slide operator, you can actually just scroll through to the next slide. So we just talked about arts and culture. Here we have workforce development strategies. Next slide. Neighborhood connectivity, transit access and safety. Next slide. Ensuring a healthy community and ecology. And we can continue on. And I love that, you know, we talked a little bit earlier in the keynote about youth opportunities, bringing youth in. This is something I'm actually very passionate about, but youth opportunities were included as well. And last strategy here. And as I talked about, housing security was extremely important. And one of the things that sort of evolved out of these conversations was creating a pathway for home ownership, creating a home ownership club, and possibly allocating some of our project funding to support first-time homebuyers. Next slide, please. So we just wanted to give an overall look or glimpse at how our budget works. And as I mentioned, the project is about 140 million. We're saying more like 150 just over time with some of the costs of construction. And to date, and actually this was developed just a couple of months ago, we were already well underway with 102 million secured for the project. And we continue to propose on some public resources and solicit for some philanthropic funding as well. Next slide. And really truly getting to the heart of ensuring that we maximize every effort to build capacity from within the community. Our fundraising team, CCS, originally came on because we thought that their mission aligned the most with the overall goals of our India Basin Shoreline Park project. So we went through a pretty rigorous selection process. And off the bat, they wanted to commit to a fellowship for a youth in the community. And we actually pushed to expand that fellowship over time. So here's just a photo of Daryl Watkins, who's actively working on the project. He's not only a youth leader, but a college student at San Jose State, balancing his college life as well as this opportunity to learn more about his own community and possibly take some of the strategies that he's learning through the fundraising efforts into his future. So we are trying to maximize every opportunity to bring youth in and really move the needle and change the dynamic around representation in the fundraising field. And we just thought it was not only a great opportunity for Daryl, but he has been exceptional at the role and continues to be. Next slide. So he actually helped with some early feedback around building a case study for our project to propose our project to private funders. And we have been fairly successful. We're still underway with that part of the project, but we're dedicating a minimum of $10 million exclusively to equitable development. And part of the work that he's doing, part of the work that CCS team is actually doing for our project is to bring those dollars in so that we can not only build a great park, but beyond that park and be responsive to what the community's needs are. So that's, I think my last slide is a thank you, but that's a big overview of what we've been doing in the city. And again, we're just so humbled to be here and be around a ton of folks with like-minded intentions for our future. You know, I'm extremely happy that I have the opportunity to serve as the executive director of the A. Philip Randolph Institute, but also as the equitable development plan manager on this project. And really my goal is to make sure that I leave a legacy. So I've been doing this now for over 12 years as the executive director. But before I leave, I want to make sure that I am able to pass the torch. So it's often very fulfilling and inspiring to work with young people that have so much potential to continue on this work even when I'm long gone. So thank you for your time, and I'm open for any questions or feedback at this point.
Great. Thank you, Jackie. That was fascinating and such an important project, clearly, to the community there. Just stepping back for a moment, so connecting this to what Elizabeth and Dr. Waterhouse were saying, these equitable development projects are so community specific. I mean, I think that's the main takeaway, whether it's within a particular city or nationally. This is not one size fits all. Communities have different needs and different priorities, and Jackie has just represented a great way that she is really plugged in and really responsive to the needs of her community. So let's get into some questions about your project. I'd like to start out with, how did you get into this? What's the role of the A. Philip Randolph Institute? Had you done brownfields before? Are you doing the community engagement and the fundraising? Are you supervising the remediation contractor? I mean, what's your role? What's the city's role? The other partners' role? You know, talk about that, please.
So our organization has been around actually since the early 60s, and we came out of the civil rights movement in Washington, D.C. And our chapters began to really sprout up just after that, because our mission was to get folks educated and participating in voting activities. So for years, our organization went into very low income communities of color throughout San Francisco to provide access to education around voting and assist in getting folks engaged. And so for years we did those activities, but while we were doing those activities, we were also assessing, well, what are the challenges? What are the barriers to voter participation? And we found that if folks are struggling to make ends meet, to put food on the table, to raise their families, the last thing they're thinking about is voting. And that was where we started to develop out our public service programs, which included workforce development. And because our leaders were intertwined with our unions at that time, and we still are. We have a historic relationship with the unions in the nation. We thought that workforce development could be one of the first ways that we could address some of the needs that the community had. And so indirectly, I had been working on multiple brownfields projects through workforce development initiatives to help clean up different parts of our community. So we don't only have brownfield impacts, but we also have Superfund sites in our neighborhood. And so we started off building pathways into construction so that the folks that actually lived in the neighborhood could not only clean the environment, but build their buildings and resources and infrastructure in the neighborhood. And so that was why we were sort of indirectly working on this project. But what got me to this project was they were hosting community meetings, and it was great because they were right in the neighborhood at a small church called Our Lady Lourdes. But the moment I walked into some of these meetings, I didn't see my community. The folks that participated were people that had enough time and affluency to be able to participate in meetings like this. They were not the folks that were actually living on the Hill. And so I asked my Recreation and Parks Department at the time, like, we got to change this dynamic. We got to make sure that the community that lives here is showing up and participating. And it was a difficult conversation because, of course, park projects are not, again, the priority. If we've got community violence, if we've got long-standing impacts of environmental issues where, our low birth rates are much higher, our asthma rates are much higher, and our overall health conditions are impaired, that's not the priority for folks. So I had to meet people where they were. I had to get them interested, and I had to connect them to how some of this park project is going to impact those larger issues that plague our community. And that was when they said, you know what, you're right. We really want to make sure community is participating. We have to do this differently. So they initially contracted my organization to provide community engagement and outreach. But I told them, hey, this isn't just us bringing folks to the table. We have to really think about how valuable the information is that people are sharing with us in order for us to create this future vision. And that evolved into us coming up with a strategy to create an equitable development plan. And from there, we've touched so many different aspects of the project, from workforce development to actual construction happening on site, to continued engagement and all the events that are associated with not only bringing folks down, but changing that dynamic of folks feeling like they should own this space. This should be community space.
Fantastic. So we saw from the poll at the beginning, we have a lot of local government folks on the call. If city governments, local governments are not already engaged with community organization, brownfield projects, what advice might you give to local governments about engaging with communities?
For me, I think, like I mentioned, the first thing that I think is extremely important is prioritizing community first, meeting community where they are. And as Elizabeth mentioned, making sure that we make this something that is tangible for them to understand and feel empowered to participate in. And that really, no matter what I think, which, I've got my own thoughts, these thoughts are a collaboration of community engagement. It has been challenging at times because not everyone agrees to different ideas. or we've got a ton of ideas that we know at the end of the day, we're not going to be able to do everything, but it's a balance, and it's being open and honest with community, meeting them where they are, and having those hard conversations that help move our project along.
Great, thank you. I want to fold in some questions that are coming from the participants, and it looks like there are a couple of questions about workforce development. Somebody wants to know if you've interacted with San Francisco's City Build, which trains and then hires or sets trainees up with their next job. And somebody wants to know about the 5-part consortium and workforce development. So if you can talk about those elements, please.
I'm so excited to talk about City Build, because actually City Build is one of the partnerships that our organization has had for over 12 years as I've been here at the Institute. And it has been one of the most successful pathways for our community members to get information, to get trained, and then to enter into a career pathway to a sustainable career. And not only have we partnered with the Office of Economic and Workforce Development, which actually holds City Build, we were the ones that suggested that City Build should be a part of this process, that we should also think about ways to incorporate special trainings for community members to be able to be prepared as we begin construction on site. So the EPA funding that we had, we actually married with the city funding for City Build, and worked with those partners from City College to our unions to be able to incorporate that program. Now, City Build is an 18-week program that not everybody has the ability to dedicate 18 weeks that are unpaid for training. So what we were able to do specifically for this project, and this is where our 5-city partnership also comes in, because again, I was saying earlier that we really mirrored what we did in San Francisco with what we learned from the 11th Street Bridge project in Washington, D.C., and collectively proposed on additional funding to be able to create an accelerated training program. So instead of being in the 18-week long program, we're in a more focused program that is about 6 weeks and prepares those folks for construction, but also gets them into the union, where they not only have opportunity on this project, but they have opportunities on projects city and area wide. So you once you're in the union, you actually have a lot more opportunity to work on projects in the entire region.
Very good. In the course of developing the partnerships and the plan here, did a community benefit or workforce or local hiring agreement come up? Is that something that's in place here?
Yes, so our city, one of the initiatives that my organization, along with a suite of other community nonprofits, worked on over 10 years ago was our local hire ordinance. And so that while that is in place, when we look at some of the funding opportunities, including the funding that we received from EPA, we actually could not apply those conditions to our contract. It was something that we couldn't apply. So we did face some challenges figuring out ways to select a local contractor and work with the local workforce, at least on the first phase of our project, which is the remediation, which is just about to complete now. And some of those challenges, we tried to figure out other ways to be creative without being restricted by some of the red tape that our government has. And so at least for the remediation, where, as I mentioned, we've got EPA funding. What we did was we went through a rigorous process to select a local contractor. So even though the initial bid went out, we didn't have any local contractors originally bid on that. So we had to delay the project just a little bit to repropose it and hope that we did get local vendors. And this is where we targeted reaching out to those local construction vendors because we just thought maybe they didn't know the opportunity existed. So we were very fortunate to get a contractor that was here in Bayview Hunters Point that understood our overall goals of local participation. And we still had a little bit of, we met a few challenges along the way. Where, my community has invested so many years in construction pathways that we actually have contractors that live in the neighborhood that will pass by a project and look at it and they'll be like, I don't see no Black people on this project. I don't see any local vendors, right? And so although we tried to maximize our ability to do that by hiring a local contractor, we still saw some challenges. So as we move into this next phase, and our bid is actually currently out right now, we've done a couple of things that are different. The first most important thing was create a bid package that instead of going with lowest possible bid, we created a best value criteria. And we've been fortunate to work with the African American Construction Collective that's really centered in my community to help develop out a additional questionnaire, a supplemental questionnaire that is scored in addition to your bid, that also, again, allows us to focus on the best value. So which contractors not only will work with the local businesses, our local and hyper-local businesses, but which are the ones that are willing to create workforce development pathways, career pathways, not just for this job, but that will address some of the future needs that many of these apprentices have. So many people may or may not know that you have to work hundreds of hours in an apprenticeship until you journey out. And some of the challenges we saw just historically have been, yes, you can get an apprentice on the project, but if their project is only 2 weeks long, what happens to that worker after that? And so by working again with community, with folks that actually do construction that will employ many of these folks, we've created that questionnaire to help score additionally that, not only will weed out some of the bad players, but might open up an opportunity to find really great community partners as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, we're running toward the end of this. I'm sorry we didn't get to more questions, but I want to highlight just some resources that are available to communities across the country as you're looking to engage these projects. We've talked about the EPA grants, but also I encourage you to look at your state and your locality to see if they have grants to help you engage in brownfields, in pre-development activities, in planning, in community engagement. The EPA grants are available to local governments and to nonprofits for assessments, for job trainings, and for cleanups. I hope everybody knows about the TAB program. TAB is Technical Assistance to Brownfields. These are nonprofits that are already funded across the country to help you with your project. And go to EPA's website, as Dr. Waterhouse said, you can look up your local TAB provider and call them. They can help you write a grant. They can help you work on a project. They can help you think through funding. They can help you look at technical information. Call your TAB. Groundwork USA is the TAB for environmental justice across the country. So definitely avail yourself of those resources. Doesn't cost anything to have a conversation. And also with the National Brownfield Coalition, we are a network of practitioners, private sector, public sector, nonprofits, academics. Hopefully by being on this, you're going to be on our mailing list. We encourage you to join the coalition, join the conversation. There's a National Brownfields Coalition forum on LinkedIn. And we do lots of webinars and panels like today. So with that, I want to thank my co-panelist here, Jackie Flynn. I want to thank the interpreters for making this accessible to everybody. And I will turn it back to Catherine. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here for Equitable Brownfields Redevelopment.
Thank you so much, Lee and Jackie, and a big round of applause both for this panel and for the entire event today. From our keynote, our EPA hosts, and the panel. It gave us so many inspiring and great opportunities for collaboration and for advancing equity through brownfields redevelopment.